what I really realize is that people want to buy secondhand, and secondhand is a really important piece of reducing fashion emissions, but it's too frictionful experience. I think it's really important to have fallow seasons in your life, especially for in this culture. There's this sense that you always need to be producing things and performing. Just like with the field, you need to sometimes allow yourself to replenish so that you can have a better outcome. I think some of it is a little bit of not necessarily a selection bias, but because there's a very high bar for women who are raising, and there's this sense, I think, with any maybe underrepresented group in any situation, you kind of feel like you need to overachieve and outperform your counterparts to be able to be deemed as worthy.
Sarah Pinner is the CEO and co-founder of Beni, a Chrome extension that finds resale alternatives from across the internet in the click of a button. Originally from Santa Barbara and having studied political economy at Berkeley for undergrad, she went on to work at Rabobank Wholesale Banking North America for 4 years, where her passion for sustainability, agriculture, and policy served her through multiple roles working with food and law. Eventually, she transitioned to work on innovation initiatives with startups within this company as she wanted to be close to people actively solving problems within the space. Following this period, she took a year off to travel, also learning a lot about circular economy and sustainability during this time through listening to podcasts and passive learning. She returned to work in business operations and strategy and started the sustainability team at Imperfect Foods, a grocery company focused on fighting food waste, before attending Kellogg School of Management for Business School from 2020 to 2022. Beni started a bit as an accident during this time as Sarah and co-founders tried to find an accessible way to shop secondhand online. The team at Beni raised pre-seed by the end of 2021 and a seed round by the end of 2022, which was spent building out the team. Last year was spent growing partnerships with resale marketplaces, growing the user base, expanding the platform, and maturing the product front. They just hit 30,000 users with over 100,000 resale items viewed through Beni when they had about 2,000 users at the same time last year. They are currently a team of 7 full-time employees with 2 part-time folks. Beni uses AI and a matching algorithm to compare your search items with items available on resale websites and generates profit through commission on sales brought about by Beni's search abilities. Tune in to hear us chat about the journey of Beni so far. So, can you please give me and listeners a brief background to how you and your co-founder came to starting Beni based on your past experiences?
Yeah. So going back kind of all the way to the beginning, I've sort of always been a bit of a like waste nerd, a bit of a trash nerd. So as a kid, I would like turn off my siblings' like faucet while they were brushing their teeth to reduce water waste, and I would collect little things. And so I've always kind of been fascinated by the idea of trash and waste, which is sort of funny. And then kind of as I, that tied into a broader interest in sustainability throughout my whole life, which eventually brought me to Beni. But prior to Beni, I graduated from UC Berkeley and then worked primarily in the food and ag industry. So I worked first with food and ag corporates and food and ag startups doing innovation initiatives through a bank. And we were, I got a chance to work together with folks who were solving really interesting problems and were really close to the customer, and sort of always wanted to be on the other side of the table, wanted to be not necessarily the entrepreneur, didn't necessarily see myself as one when I was younger, but wanted to really be close to problems and really be close to problems around sustainability. So I left and joined Imperfect Foods, which is a food waste focused grocery company. And that was really my first official step in now my career within the circular economy. And at Imperfect, I led expansion initiatives and then started the sustainability team. And one thing I loved about Imperfect was that it was really focused on making the sustainable solution very attractive and convenient and affordable for everyday folks. And so I had that lens with me when I went to business school, and that's where Beni was born. And so it was born sort of out of this lens and this background that I had. And then also just conversations I was having with friends where they'd say something like, yeah, I know I should buy secondhand, but I just don't. Like, I don't want to go scroll on eBay for 3 hours. I don't find the hunt very thrilling. I just don't even know where to start. And what I really realized is that people want to buy secondhand, and secondhand is a really important piece of reducing fashion emissions, but they don't know how to. It's too frictionful experience. So we started Beni, which is a browser extension that kind of shops along with you and brings you resale options to what you're looking for online, really to bridge that gap, to bring resale to shoppers instead of bring shoppers to resale. And just quickly on my co-founders, so I have two co-founders now, and one is our CTO, and she has a background in software and environmental science, and we were both in the food waste space. So we got connected as food waste nerds, and she joined in 2021. And Kate, our CMO, joined in 2021 as well. And I met her at school, and she has a background in brand and launched Bud Light Seltzer. So we are a fully female founded team, and which is great, but obviously is unique in the space. So
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for going over all that. And I'm excited to ask more about each piece of that throughout this interview, especially, yeah, the female founding. That's incredible. Love that so much. I kind of want to walk through like each of your experiences and ask you about learnings you had from them, because it's just personally an interesting time, like mid-20s, trying to figure out what to do. And I think each experience kind of plays a role. So as for your first, like your early career in industry, when you worked for, is it Rabobank? Is that what it's called?
Rabobank, yeah, it's a Dutch
Okay.
bank. It's sort of a weird name in English,
Okay.
but it's
Okay.
A Dutch bank.
Okay, I didn't want to mispronounce it. But yeah, what would you say were like some of your main takeaways from that time? You were working there for 4 years, but you like had a bunch of different roles. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say before I start kind of in that specific one, the at least in looking back at my career, which is still a lot to unfold, I've sort of come to realize I feel like it sort of is like Legos. Obviously people sometimes think of a career progression as kind of a ladder and like one step to the next. I feel like with my career, it's sort of been like each step is sort of like one Lego, and you're like learning things and building things and getting insights. And then the next step is somehow connected to that Lego block, but it might be, right on top where all the points are connected, or it might just be like one of those little Lego pieces connects to the next Lego piece. So that's sort of my my theory of my career growth. So I'll start with the Lego block of Rabobank. And yeah, I in undergrad studied political economy and Italian, which was, very useful. And I actually was very interested in food and ag related policy and sustainability policy, just sort of initially out of undergrad. And so I wanted to kind of learn about the industry first. And I definitely, candidly coming from Berkeley, a very liberal school, I was sort of like, I don't want to work at a bank. Like, I don't want to work for the man or whatever. But I was very lucky to get the job. And I took it because I did want to kind of have a bird's eye view into the industry. And I do feel like some of those more professional services type roles, banking, consulting, things like that, are an interesting place to start because you can kind of see a lot of different functions, and you can also see a lot of different sort of pieces of, the industry, CPG and, you know, agriculture and all this stuff. So when I was there, the first couple years I was in on the corporate lending side, and so learned sort of a lot of just foundational pieces of, accounting and working in Excel and building PowerPoints and things like that that I still very much use to this day. So that was great. I definitely found that banking was not my calling. I think one thing I learned was some folks are very energized by doing deals, and some folks are very energized by sort of building things over time. In banking, it's a lot of doing deals with a lot of different companies, and that wasn't particularly where I found energy. I really wanted to kind of like build things and help build things. And so I transitioned within the bank to work on innovation initiatives. So did a number of different things working with food and ag startups, kind of in a time where food and ag startups were sort of a new thing. And I really loved building new things, kind of entrepreneurship. And then, like I said, I got a chance to see what it looks like on the other side of the table when you're kind of more in the company and closer to a customer, and that helped me understand kind of where I wanted to go next.
Okay. Thank you for sharing all of that. So, you were talking about doing deals versus building something over time. Was working in banking, was it similar to investment banking or was it something different?
Yeah, so I worked in corporate lending, which is essentially working with really large companies, Starbucks size companies, and they all have bank accounts, for lack of a better term. Like we have bank accounts, so they have like loans of some sort. And so a lot of it is building, it's called sort of relationship management. And so you're building relationships with these companies as one of their bankers and then lending them money, large sums of money. And so I was working with the relationship managers. And like I said, I think I learned a lot of foundational skills building PowerPoints, working in Excel. I also definitely learned the importance of kind of building relationship capital with partners, and especially with when you're building kind of longer term relationships in a business setting. That was a really interesting experience to kind of also learn some of how those soft skills translate to business outcomes. But like I said, a lot of fundamentally, like you're doing deals with a lot of different companies, same as like, yeah, investment banking or consulting or venture capital. And some people get a lot of energy out of that. I really kind of wanted to, I like getting down to the nitty gritty and really kind of building something over a longer period of time, just personally. And so that's where sort of I focused on in my career to date.
I see. Okay. That's cool that you were able to witness both paths and kind of like suss out which one you prefer. And then after those 4 years, you took a year off, right, to
Hmm.
travel. So I was wondering how you view that now. And in your opinion, what are some of the benefits you experienced from taking that time off? And would you ever recommend it to others, like in their 20s? If so, why?
Yes, I would recommend it in the sense that for me, it was very impactful. And I think it was the right time for me. I felt like I had the right perspective on it. I don't necessarily think everyone needs to go travel for a year or do it in the same way, but the sort of the way in which I kind of describe that period in looking back is I call it my fallow season. So when in agriculture, when you fallow a field, you don't plant anything for a whole season on that field, or you might plant some cover crops, but essentially what you're doing is you're allowing the soil underneath to replenish and the life to really come back into that soil to be able to plant things in the future. And the reason I I think it's really important to have fallow seasons in your life is because, especially for in this culture, it's like there's this sense that you always need to be like producing things and performing and be very like outwardly working on yourself. And I just like with the field, you need to sometimes allow yourself to kind of replenish so that you can produce quote unquote more or better in the future and like kind of have a better outcome. And so that could look like traveling like it did for me. It could look like taking a couple months off between work and doing something. It could be having a side art project that you're doing, but anything that allows yourself to kind of replenish your internal soil, I think is really critical. And for me, I did really love traveling because it puts you into new places and it can kind of help you put yourself against different backdrops and understand yourself. It's very fun. So you're having a lot of joy. And then also it's kind of an opportunity to be bored, for lack of a better term. And I think I did a lot of hiking and walking around and like listening to podcasts about the circular economy and just thinking about stuff and allowing my brain to like explore things. And I feel as though a lot of the kind of core, the thoughts that I was having and the kind of things I was learning about myself and about the circular economy very much allowed me to then see some of the insights that ended up leading to Beni in a way that if I hadn't taken that time to allow myself to think and be bored and wander, I don't think I would have kind of understood those things. So yes, if you have the privilege to do it, it is a huge privilege. I would definitely recommend it to kind of understand what like a fallow season is for you.
Yeah, I love that description of it. And I completely agree. I'm kind of in that era right now, although I don't think it will last an entire year. But it is a privilege to, I think it's a privilege to experience boredom, because then you start to think about things or get creative with how you spend your time. Where if you're always busy and you're always working towards something, sometimes you don't have that opportunity to slow down and think about other things. It's really nice to hear how it was for you and how it affected ultimately what you're doing today as well. But I also would like to ask you about your experience starting the sustainability team at Imperfect Foods. Yeah, to elaborate, it sounds like you had some experience with sustainability prior to that. So did that help you be in a position where you were like eligible to take that on?
Great question. So I basically forced myself into this position as slash created the position and the team. So I would say it was one of the experiences in my life where I didn't necessarily, and even looking back, have the skills to do that. I wouldn't have, I think, been like hired externally as the head of sustainability. I did have, during this year off, I had been learning about sustainability for a long time, but I invested even more to learning about the circular economy, understanding kind of frameworks around sustainability. And really, the way it happened was I was on the business operations team. So I was doing other things, launching partnerships in new markets. And I joined Imperfect in large part, for the mission. And one thing that I was noticing was as Imperfect had grown, there were elements of the operations that were not as sustainable as they could have been. And so honestly, I talked to some people about it, and I just started a breakfast meetup with some people in the company to talk about some of those things. It was primarily focused initially on packaging, because I was very interested and focused on reusable packaging. And so we kind of came up with some ideas, and I really wanted, and it was really interesting, but I realized that at that moment we had some ideas of how to kind of reduce the impact of the packaging, and I could either use my internal capital and my efforts to like force a few of those initiatives through, or I could sort of create more of an infrastructure and a framework internally where those initiatives can kind of continue to be prioritized. And so that's why I started working more on a sustainability team and sustainability metrics and sustainability goals, because if that wasn't in place, if I left the company or there wasn't someone there who like wanted to push some of these initiatives through, they just like it wasn't going to be prioritized. And so it was really just then about on the side of my other job, understanding, okay, how do we think about sustainability? Getting some other folks to work on this project with me, getting my manager to allow me to work on it. And eventually we ended up then working with a carbon accounting company, getting a baseline, setting a few goals for what it meant for Imperfect, what sustainability meant for Imperfect, because sustainability means a lot of things. And eventually that turned into a full sustainability team and sustainability goals at the top of the company. So I think that it was a really clear example to me that like if you see an opportunity and you feel that you have at least the passion and the energy to kind of make things better, it's worth doing it, even if you don't maybe have the like all the expertise that you might think you need. It's really often about just like someone who's willing to figure it out.
Okay, very cool to hear. It sounds like I was thinking as you were talking, you took a sustainable approach to creating like lasting sustainability efforts at Imperfect. So
Yeah, I
instead
like
of,
that way of
yeah.
putting it.
So like instead of like putting it all on yourself to drive it, you created something that like might outlast you there within the company, which is cool. Um
Yeah, Yeah, and I think in general, it's interesting just to recognize like I think it was one of those things where I knew that most people wanted to make the right decisions and all the teams wanted to understand if they could do things more sustainably, but if that wasn't a goal or a metric that they were being evaluated on, it just they weren't going to prioritize that, and that's just like fundamentally makes sense. And so yeah, I think sometimes kind of slowing down to speed up or thinking about should I spend my energy on this one initiative or should I spend my energy on creating an infrastructure where more initiatives like this can be prioritized. And sometimes maybe the former is better. It's like, no, we need to get this done. We're just going to figure out how to do it. But I think in this situation, I'm really glad that we did that because now my former coworker is still the head of sustainability at Imperfect, and they're doing great stuff. So it's really cool to see how that can kind of definitely outlast like my time there.
Yeah, very cool. Good to hear. And also good to hear that you it sounds like you broke your way into working in sustainability within that company instead of being hired on as like head of sustainability from prior experience. So it's good to know that that's possible and how you did it yourself. I have seen job roles in like fashion in particular I'm interested in that are like head of sustainability now at certain companies. So sometimes I'm like, how does one come to be eligible for that role, I guess. So it's interesting. Were there ever times during your career where you weren't sure what you wanted to do? And in that same vein, what led you to the decision to go to business school? And was there an intent before going to start a company?
Yeah, so there were definitely times in my career where I didn't know what I wanted to do. I would say, joining Rabobank, I never pictured myself working at a bank. And now when I tell people that I worked at a bank, they're surprised. But I think it was, early on, that was really helpful just to kind of like, again, it was at least tangentially related to what I was interested in. And I knew it would help me develop great skills, but I didn't know after undergrad definitely what I wanted to do. Once after those for a year, 4 years, taking the time off, actually, for context, I had applied to business school previously before I took the year off, and I didn't get in, which looking back was like awesome because I do think I was applying to business school because I didn't really know what the next step was for me after the bank. I knew I didn't necessarily want to be there, but I didn't know exactly what that meant. Um, and so that was kind of that first piece. And I would say I know people who go to business school because they want to really explore, and that's totally fine. But it is there's a lot going on at grad school, and it's expensive, and so you do want to have some level of like direction. I think of like what do you want to learn at least. And I think at that point I was like, oh, this just like feels like it makes sense as the next step, but I didn't really know why I wanted to go. And so I took the year off. And during that year, I basically sort of said, I want to dedicate my career to working on the problem of waste. And it's still a relatively broad goal, but it at least helped me eliminate a lot of things. And I didn't know, I'm a little bit less like focused on the function that I want to have. I'm not like, I want to be an accountant. I'm more about the problem area and sort of broad industries, but mainly the problem area. And that was really helpful. Then coming back helped me kind of guide myself to Imperfect. And then when I applied to business school the second time, I only applied to the program that I ended up going to. It was really the only program that I felt like still would kind of help get me to the next level. And when I did, I had a really clear goal. I wanted to work on the problem of waste. I wanted to understand how to identify new opportunities to drive solutions. And so it was kind of A, I think it helped me get in, and B, it helped me understand where I wanted to focus at school. I didn't go in thinking I was gonna start something. Um, but because I just had that lens, I think that's really what helped me identify that problem when all my friends were saying, I know I should buy secondhand, but I just don't. I was like, had that kind of, I knew I wanted to work in that area. And so that helped me kind of narrow it down. So I think now going forward in my career, again, I don't necessarily know, like, I think my function will probably change throughout my career. If you're sort of a generalist, that can happen. But I know I will always be working on this problem, which is a helpful way to narrow down what is a lot of options in the world.
Yeah, great to hear your experience with that because, yeah, it's just, it can be overwhelming, the different options of what to do. That's just always good to hear how other people have approached it. And I like the idea of, a mission you care about and you will find a way to work towards helping that mission. That leaves a lot of flexibility. So I feel like there's a lot of different things you can do where you're fulfilling that like destiny you've set for yourself. So, can you also talk about like the journey of starting Beni? It sounds like your two co-founders joined in 2021. I don't know if Beni started like how long exactly before that, but like maybe how you met your co-founders and how your different like skill sets come together in running it today.
Yeah, so the idea for Benny was end of 2020. So it was really just me working on it at that point, and was actually part of a case competition through business school. So I was very much not like doing it to start a company, but it was really helpful because there was a lot of structure, right? I had to like pitch something in December of 2020, and we ended up winning that competition, which was pretty cool. Gave us some money to test things after that. But that was, I could talk about that for that like very initial phase. I do tell people, if if you're in the stage of like, you have an idea, and but you know, researching an idea could take you forever, right? And so kind of giving yourself a deadline of like, okay, in 3 months I'm going to get four people that I really respect together, and I'm going to pitch them this idea, and I'm going to have some level of like, do users want it, is it technically possible, how would we make money, right? And it doesn't need to have everything figured out, but just like have some boundaries around it so that you can kind of move to the next step, instead of, I think if I didn't have that, I would have been sort of researching the idea for just forever. So then after that, I really was just curious about like, okay, people seem to think this idea is interesting. I think this idea is interesting. What's the next big question that we would need to answer to understand, like, is this possible? And it really was like, is this technically feasible? Like, how would one build this? And I am not a software engineer. So I actually typed software engineer into my LinkedIn because I was like, I know some smart people. And Celine, my co-founder, came up. We had been acquaintances prior to that. My dad actually introduced us because we were both food waste nerds, and she lives in where I grew up. And it was just, I will say, in most of the team for Benny, there was a good amount of serendipity, which is always like not necessarily helpful to other people. But so I reached out. She was super interested. She had actually a lot of folks in her life who had worked at Honey, so she knew about the extension space. And really, to start, it wasn't, hey, do you want to get married and be my co-founder forever for this company? It was more, we want to answer these questions. Like, do you want to help explore these questions with me? And I think, and she was still working at her job at the time, but that was a really helpful way to start to work together and narrow it down. Because if you just start by saying, I want to start a company, like that, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that was kind of how she came on board. And then Kate, sort of similarly, we were at business school together, and we were, for one of the quarters, sort of working on Benny through a class, an entrepreneurship class, and you need a team for that. And I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, and I said, I'm still looking for someone on the team who has marketing background. And literally during that conversation, Kate texted our mutual friend saying, do you think Sarah's looking for someone for her team for this class? And she has a marketing background, obviously. So there was that serendipity, and I do think that helped me have the confidence to keep working on Benny, and has helped us, grow as the company grows. But it takes time. And again, we worked together for months before sort of officially being co-founders or being co-workers. And I think a lot of folks might jump into like wanting to have a co-founder of something that doesn't really exist. But I think for us, we approached it of like, do you want to help us answer these really big questions? And then now, obviously, yes, there's a company around that, but I found that to be helpful.
Okay, very good to know the origin story of Beni and how you all met and worked together. And so how do the timelines align between like you finishing business school, which is like 2 years, right? And then like the evolution of Beni. So is this something you're like working on while you're still at school? It must have been, right? Because
Yeah. Yeah. So it started my first quarter of school, again, not necessarily planned. And so worked on it pretty much throughout school. Graduated in 2022. And so, initially I'd say, so we were working on Benny throughout that first quarter. My first summer, I didn't have an internship. I actually worked on it full time through a program of the school where they do support entrepreneurs pretty well. If you go seeking for it, they have money and resources. And so I sort of saw myself as, a full time. I was actually doing a dual degree as well, so a full time student working on Benny on the side. But then we got to a place where we wanted to really invest in it and bring my co-founder Celine on full time. And so we went out to raise our pre-seed. So we raised our pre-seed in 2021, which was the October, so the first quarter of my second year. And then after that, once we had raised money, I sort of flipped it mentally, and I sort of said, I'm working full time and I'm going to school on the side. It obviously was a lot of balancing a lot of stuff, but I do feel like for those first few years, it was nice to be working on it while in school because there was a lot of infrastructure. There were other people, other entrepreneurs working on other things. There was some financial support, things like that. So that was kind of how it worked initially. And we were a fully remote team. So we've always been remote. Celine is in Santa Barbara. I was in Chicago. And then, obviously when I graduated, worked on it officially full time, and Kate joined full time as well at that point. And so we have about 7 full time folks now. And yeah, it's sort of weird to look back. It's hard to describe all the ups and downs, but it's really been just like understanding what's the next big question we need to answer for this thing to work. And, it was initially kind of early tests, then it was more the technology, now it's more user growth. And so that's really we're sort of still in that phase, but definitely have come a long way since the initial building in school.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, that must have been quite a lot to handle for sure, but very cool that you were able to swing it and do both. Could you talk a little bit about Beni and how it works for listeners? I remember when we first chatted, you mentioned it's kind of like an aggregator, almost like Google Flights. So I was wondering if you could walk me and listeners through the process of searching for an item, how suggestions are then like garnered and provided to the user, and then how it matches with like potential of other items.
Yeah. So our core product is a browser extension. So if you have Honey or Capital One Shopping, same kind of experience for you. And from a user experience, before I talk about the backend, essentially the way it works is, let's say you're shopping on Anthropologie or Nordstrom or Nike, and you're looking at an item like a pair of shoes, we will actually pop down right there and show you the same or similar shoes that are listed for secondhand on resale marketplaces. So that's really from a user experience what Beni is. We also have the ability for you to search directly on the app. If you say, I know I want these Nike shoes secondhand, you can do that. And the back end to Beni is the same for both. And it really is, initially, to your point, the fact that we aggregate listings from over 40 marketplaces. So Poshmark and Grailed and The Real Real. We have partnerships with all of them. So we have pretty much all the resale listings in our database. And then, however, you're searching, whether it's by using the extension or searching directly, we are kind of, we're matching the attributes of what you're searching for with attributes of products in our database because resale has no SKU numbers or identifiers. So it's a kind of it's a very messy type of data. But with the extension, we use the image and the text to find the relevant products. And then you simply just click through and purchase it on the resale site. So in that sense, it's sort of like a Google Flights where we help you find the best option for you. And then you go and purchase it there. And really the goal is to bridge the gap between e-commerce and re-commerce, and we want to make it just as easy to find and buy things secondhand as it is new. And it doesn't mean you need to buy everything secondhand, but right now the experience of going out and finding those shoes on one of the 40 resale marketplaces is just so onerous compared to just buying it new. And so as much as possible, we want to make it super seamless. So we have the extension that's available on desktop, Chrome and Safari, and also on iOS Safari, so on your phone. And then the search is available on the app as well.
Okay, very cool. I'm really curious, how did it work in the beginning before you had the partnerships established with other resale marketplaces?
Great question. So the first thing we did was a very, very scrappy MVP where we actually just asked people to give us links to items that they wanted, and we manually found them alternatives and emailed them back. And that was, again, really like we just wanted to test if we make it really easy for people, will they buy things secondhand? And they did. So we, obviously an early test, but we got to know the marketplaces very well. I was in a lot of my business school classes shopping for people on Poshmark and eBay. From there, before we started, sort of before and in order to raise the pre-seed, we built a really early version of the extension we called like the alpha, which actually used Google Shopping on the back end. So we were basically just like querying Google Shopping and putting it in the extension. It was super ugly, not great, but it allowed us to sort of start to understand like what would be needed in the infrastructure, kind of show the product idea at least in action to be able to get some folks excited for the pre-seed. And then after that, or kind of around the same time, we started actually going out to get relationships with the marketplaces. So it took us a while, but we started very early to build these partnerships because we knew they were so critical, obviously, to Beni working. And so then for a while, we were essentially kind of in 2022 building the technology as we were kind of building partnerships. So we were sort of building the infrastructure and then piping in the product feeds.
Okay,
But yeah, I
good to
would
know.
say early on, I think this structure of like, okay, here's this idea for the business, this idea for the product. What are the assumptions we're making and which of these is the riskiest, which is the biggest question. If this is not true, none of this will work. And like, how can we test that in the lowest lift way? So for us, the big question initially was, yeah, will people even purchase secondhand? They say they will, but will they? That's why we did the really manual MVP. And from there, it helps you kind of navigate where to start, because with any business, it's like, do you start with selling? Do you start with building? Do you start with user growth? And so I think it helps to narrow down what is the riskiest place, and that's where you should start.
Okay. The riskiest place, as in, like, if people won't shop secondhand, even if you make it super accessible, then what are we even doing? Like, is that what you mean? Like, sort of
Yeah, like for
establishing.
us, that was that first question. And then we validated, like, yeah, they will buy it. So that de-risks it. And then the next big question was like, let's say it's resale marketplaces will partner with us. Okay, let's go out and try to start seeing if they'll partner with us, right? And that's very different for different businesses. And sometimes the core technology is the riskiest piece. If this search algorithm doesn't work, we have nothing. And so I think it's there, you can look it up. It's called like the riskiest assumptions framework online, and it just helps kind of understand where should we be building and testing first, especially early on, because there's just so many big questions that need to be answered and you can't answer them all at once.
Mm-hmm. And so, throughout this whole process, it seems like there have been many iterations, as there probably would be with any product. What were some of the main challenges from what you recall?
Um, I would say the main challenges, one was the partnerships for sure, getting access to the data, which just took time and takes a lot of like understanding how to build relationships, which comes from my experience at Rabobank to harken back to the original days, um, and understanding how to navigate getting big companies to do things with tiny companies. But that's, we were able to have something valuable enough to offer them that it worked. And then I'd say fundamentally the technology, and the ability to surface relevant inventory resale data is super messy, and understanding like what are people's intentions when they're shopping and when they're searching, and how do we make sure we're always delivering a very curated experience. And that's still a huge, it will always be a focus area for us, but went through a lot of iterations of different algorithms, different combinations of technologies. It's all AI, so you're using a lot of different models and things like that. And we've gotten to a place where kind of foundationally we have everything in place, and now it's more about how do we use this to make it an even better experience. But this is a type of product where like if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If you're looking at boots and we show you a shirt, like that doesn't work, and you can't really hack the back end technology that much. So we have put a lot of investment in the tech before we could really start focusing on user growth, which is just a risk.
Mm. Yeah, I would imagine it would be difficult with all the decisions of what to focus on first and how that will best maximize your chances of success. I'm curious if you could talk more about the technology behind Beni, like the AI, the search algorithms. How was it developing that in early days and then like now? Is that a constantly iterative process?
So I will say I will give all the credit to Celine and the engineering team. I am not a software engineer. I did not build any of the technology. I did a lot of the initial designs and kind of product decisions, but I think fundamentally one of our kind of core strategic pillars is to build for resale, not around it. A lot of the existing technologies and search platforms are sort of trying to fit resale inventory into a typical e-commerce experience, which where e-commerce is just different, right? And you want the ultimate experience to be as seamless, but like it's one of one data, it's one of one listings, it's constantly being refreshed. The product level information is very variable, right? And so thinking about what does it mean to build the database for resale and then build the search algorithm for resale, I think fundamentally was an important lens, instead of sort of saying, oh, well, we already have this search tool, let's try to fit it onto resale. And so understanding that taxonomy, and a lot of it initially was also, and so today, leveraging off the shelf technology and then kind of combining them in a unique way that makes sense. We used Google's image search for the first kind of half to be able to get things off the ground, as well as other technology. And then over the last 6-9 months, we transitioned to our own model. And so I think it is important to not, especially, I'm not a technologist, but if you are the person who is the engineer and you're starting something, I think it can be tempting to try to build everything from scratch, but ultimately understanding what's the end goal we're trying to get to for the user and for the shopper, and kind of are there ways that we can use things that already exist and combine them in a way that makes sense before just starting to build yourself. So that wasn't super helpful. I don't have that much information, but I will say with the AI piece, we've used AI since the beginning because that's like the only way you can do this. We talk about it a lot more now because people are really interested in it, but I will say Beni couldn't have existed prior to a lot of the technologies that exist for machine learning and, reverse image search and things like that. So we're very much very grateful for all of that and grateful to be a part of using it. But fundamentally, we're not necessarily an AI company, but we use AI to be able to deliver this experience to our shoppers.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely a good time for it, just from speaking to many entrepreneurs and then those that have been involved with needing investing. It definitely
Hmm.
seems like AI is right. Like it's like a big thing right now and potentially in the future. So probably not potentially, probably certainly, but I
Yeah,
don't know a
definitely,
ton.
certainly. I
Yeah.
think there's definitely a lot of hype around it in venture capital. There's always been hype around new things. I think some of the hype is like very warranted, but some of the hype is maybe a little hypey. But it is going to be a big part of things going forward.
Yeah. Okay, well, good segue then. If I could ask you about some of the articles that we talked about last time regarding VC funding. So I just want to ask you about your thoughts. So I actually have something here from the article I'm going to read if that's okay.
Yeah.
So this article from Forbes talking about like the disproportionate representation of women in VC funding and funded startups. It talks about how 2% of funding goes to women led startups and only 16% of decision makers at VC firms are women, while female founded startups outperform their male counterparts, generating 63% more value and twice as much per dollar invested, which I think are pretty insane numbers. So I was just wondering, given your experience getting investing, getting
Oh,
funding for
no.
Beni, and then also being in business school and general experience as a startup founder, what are your thoughts on those statistics?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I obviously only have my own experience, and so I'd say that it's biased, obviously. I sometimes forget, because we're actually fully female funded as well as female founded. So our whole board is women, which is very rare, but has been very interesting and cool, but has sort of made me forget sometimes that that is very rare. And so when I see these stats of just the percent of fully female founded teams that get investment dollars, it kind of brings me back to reality a little bit. And I think, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. And there's probably a lot of reasons why women may outperform. I think some of it is a little bit of like, not necessarily a selection bias, but because there's a very high bar for women who are raising. And there's this sense, I think, with any maybe underrepresented group in any situation, you kind of feel like you need to overachieve and outperform your counterparts to be able to be deemed as worthy, right? And so I think there's probably some of that psychological, I need to prove that I belong here, where male founders may not. And in terms of just the number of, there's definitely less fully female founded companies to even be available to get funding. I think that's mainly because women are, it's kind of a chicken and the egg. Like I never saw myself as an entrepreneur because I didn't really see myself in a lot of the like types of entrepreneurs that were around me in the Bay Area. So that's one thing. And then there's not a lot of women writing checks, where I remember one of our investors who's a woman, she said that she chose to leave a kind of a more mid-level role at a really big fund to go to a smaller fund so that she could have check writing capabilities, so she could be a woman who's writing checks. And that's important because, especially for something like Beni, men may not understand it as much fundamentally. Like most of our users are women, and so having a better mix of people who are writing checks and making the decisions of where investment goes is really important, both gender and race and socioeconomic background. And then I will say, one of the things I think we talked about too is there is definitely still bias and sexism in the like expectations of female founders. So one of the things that I always I always think about and tell people is that there's really solid research to show that women get asked different questions than men by both women and men. Women tend to get asked questions that are more kind of put them in a defensive point of view and like talking about the risks and the potential losses. Men tend to get asked questions about the wins and the vision. And that's what gets people excited. And so what I've kind of tended to do is knowing that that's the reality and that is the water we swim in. When I'm getting some of those questions, understand how do I turn these questions into an opportunity for me to share the vision of Beni and share about our wins so that I'm not beholden to the existing structure. So I can only say, like, I'm not shocked that it's still a small percentage. I think I would think it would be getting that more improving faster than it is, but there's definitely still a lot of bias that exists. And as much as I want to kind of ignore it, it has been important to just recognize there's got to be bias. And so how do I make sure I put myself in the best position to not not lose because of that bias?
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on all of that. I always feel limited in being able to talk about this myself because obviously I'm not like I haven't even entered the world of VC investing, but I'm very curious about it. And then, yeah, like what you said about the different types of questions, I had an example. I was going to ask you about that, but from the article from Harvard Business Review talking about promotion versus prevention based questions, like where if promotion based questions are focused on potential gains, prevention focus more on potential losses. If they're being asked disproportionately to certain genders, how that might affect like the conversations that are being had and then the likelihood of funding. So it's really interesting. But yeah, I would imagine it's just good to be aware in general if that's going to affect potentially the success of your business or the ability to get funding that you need for it to grow. So those are all the questions. Thank you, Sarah, for your time today and for talking about Beni in such depth and your career journey and experiences. Thanks again so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Such a great conversation and excited to see what you'll continue to do now and next in your career.
I hope good things. It's an interesting time for sure, but thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.